everybody. Welcome, Azim, to India.
Thank you.
Welcome, Ankur. If you're wondering what's common to the three of us, we've all moved from mainstream corporate life to the space which is called motivational speaking or personal development. I think people have become center stage in today's knowledge economy. We moved a long way from the time that people were just a workforce meant to deliver. But we are looking at human capital now. People need to be nurtured, valued, developed, motivated, inspired, and even fulfilled. So I think with all these changes, we've also looked at new definitions of success. What is success? What is being fulfilled? And also, who is a leader? So I think we'll examine some of these things. Interestingly, all of us have written books in this category where we've looked at success and fulfillment, and all of us from different points of view. So while Azim's book, I think, marries corporate excellence with Sufi philosophy, it's an interesting combination. Ankur's book, Seed of Genius, believes that everybody has a genius within himself or herself. And my book, The Winning Way, draws inspiration from sport. So let's see, might be an interesting chat, and we'll try and throw questions to people and see what are the issues and what are the challenges they are facing. So let's begin with you, Azim. How did corporate Sufi happen? What triggered it off, and what is the philosophy?
So I was a dumb kid in school. I failed all my exams. I got the worst possible result you can get in Cambridge in grade 12. So in my estimation, I was a lost case. Studying was not my cup of tea. And then I was sent out from my home in Tanzania and East Africa to Kenya to do my A-levels. And I didn't know what to do in A-levels because my results were so poor. So I did English and I did Swahili, which is my mother tongue in Africa. And I got, again, 2 E's, which is pass, but the worst pass you can get. And then I was trying to get a college in England to study, to go and further my education, because I had to do something in my life. I ended up doing ACCA by accident, which is like a chartered accounting degree. And suddenly I started enjoying accounting. And I got the best possible result in England in ACCA. Then I moved to Canada, and I got my chartered financial planning degree, and I got my CPA degree. And then in 1997, I went to do some work with the Afghan refugee as an accountant. And I saw poverty, and I was so shaken that I cried like a baby. My soul was moved. At that time, I changed my career from accounting for business to accounting for life. And I became an author and started to talk about giving as a core message. And of course, I started my new journey as an author. And corporate Sufi is somebody who I am, because I was a corporate person with 3 professional accounting degrees. But I was always a Sufi. When I say Sufi, I mean somebody who is quiet, who is reserved, who likes his own space, meditates. And so that became my brand. But I struggled in the new career. I almost gave up because I was going nowhere. After 10 years of hard work, putting so many hours, and I was going nowhere with my books and almost giving up, a book fell on my laps of a guy who was going to commit suicide, ends up writing a book and sells 50 million copies. And that's the book which fell on my laps when I was giving up. So that made me continue. And thereafter, my success started in terms of I became #1 on Amazon in 2005, topping Harry Potter. Became #1 on Amazon again in 2008. I was #1 Barnes & Noble, the biggest bookstore chain in the world, with 3,000 stores. I was #1 in India with Crossword with Jayco Book Publishers. So I've got several books in the Corporate Sufi series, and my latest book is called Business, Balance, and Beyond. Yeah? So I'll talk about this more in detail, but I'll let Ankur speak about him, and then we'll continue the dialogue.
Yeah, before that, just let me...
Sure.
So it was really disillusionment, kind of, about what you were doing? Or you just thought you could do better than what you were doing? Adding value, doing for society?
Great question, Anita. I think all of us sitting here, all of us, there's something inside us. Sometimes it's not totally ignited. For me, when I lost myself in the cause of others, the Afghan refugees, I found myself. Yeah, and I opened my birthday gift. Many people never open their birthday gift, what they're born with. The genius lies in the graves. People have died never opening their gift. I was a lousy scientist in school. I was a good accountant. But what I do now is my birthday gift. I'm 100 times better at what I do than I was an accountant, even though I got 3 degrees in accounting. And I opened my gift at the age of 43. I'm 59 now, but I feel like a 30 because I do what I love doing. There's a lot of energy. I just flew in this morning. I haven't slept a wink whole night, but I feel very fresh. So when the energy is there, when you're doing something you love doing, and when you have a goal larger than self, you lose yourself. And so my wish and my mission is to shine my light and inspire others to shine their light, to inspire others to open their birthday gift, because that gift was given to you to nourish, to ignite, and to make a positive difference in the lives of others.
Yeah, just one more thing, Azim. A lot of people want to have this kind of a eureka moment or something. So was it sudden enlightenment? This is what I want to do, or was it a journey? Because on the face of it, I think there is a contradiction there. Though in sport also people say, agitated bodies and calm minds. So in corporate you require drive, and in Sufi I would assume you require calm. So isn't that an inherent contradiction? So how easy was it, and was it a journey for you to kind of figure out how this worked?
So Anita, you asked me 2 questions. One was the marriage of the corporate and Sufi, which is an uncommon marriage. And the second is, did it just happen on one instant, or there was a collection of things? Of course, all our life, there is something happening in our life. And each thing that happens in our life, as Steve Jobs says, you connect the dots, from childhood to where you are, being an orphan, which he was, Steve Jobs, and how he was struggling and he got fired from Apple and then in the end became one of the great corporate leaders. There was connecting of dots. So in my case, from childhood, my parents were good givers. They set examples of giving. My father never told me to give, but I watched all life, I watched him give. So he didn't ever tell me that, because with words you can only preach, with action you teach. Yeah, so it was there. But the incident that happened with the Afghan refugees, I had about 14 Afghan refugees. I was interviewing them about accounting, how much money they need to live on. And I heard stories about how they've gone from war to war. I saw mosquitoes, I saw the kitchen, I saw the washroom, and in 20 minutes I got physically sick. So as I walked out of the hut, all the women and children were standing outside. And mostly women and children, no man, because men already died in the war. And I don't know if you've seen an Afghan child, rosy cheeks, big eyes, and a smile on their face despite their plight. I didn't know what to do. I was so shaken, I was sick. And they were all looking at me because I was wearing a tie. So I was there no more than 20 seconds, but it seemed like eternity. Then I took a cab ride from the hut to Marriott Hotel in Karachi. And in 25 minutes of the cab ride, I was sitting in the back of the cab, and I was shivering, and I was sweating. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried for 25 minutes. So if you ask me what was the defining moment in my life, that 25 minutes was the defining moment that changed my whole life. Now, of course, Anita is right. There was something in me from before about giving, which kind of took off with that incident. There was something in me about writing a book one day. But that was the trigger that gave me the nudge to go out and do it. And then I struggled, and I struggled, and I struggled. But if you ask me, I'm so grateful for the struggle. Because of the struggle, I got better at what I do. See, Rumi, the Sufi poet, says, you take chana, chickpea. You put chana in the boiling water. The chickpea is raw. Then it gets boiled and boiled and boiled and boiled. Eventually it becomes cooked. So Rumi says, if you haven't been boiled in your life, you're nothing. But once you get boiled and you go through struggle, you become something. So struggle, challenges, obstacles are a blessing, which makes you better at what you do. That makes you cooked.
Let's move to Ankur. Tell us, after how many years in corporate life did you make the move?
Well, I'll start right at the beginning itself. First of all, let me take off from what Azim said. He talked about most of us taking our genius to the grave, despite one of the best birthday gifts which you get, which is ourselves. And that's where my book is titled as Seed of Genius. Now, seed is not any external component. It is you yourself. You are the seed of genius, right? Now, Anita wanted to mention my corporate experience. Well, after IIM Ahmedabad, for instance, I joined Johnson & Johnson as product manager. But within 3 to 4 years, I think I realized something of myself. I was not carved out for a corporate career. I was too much of an individualist. So I took the plunge. So that is, I think, defines our question of being bold. I was bold enough at a time, I'm talking about 35 years back, when an IIM graduate It was unthinkable for any IIM guy to, start off on his own with nothing. I had no industrialist dad or anything at all. Now, this book is what I am sharing my entire experience with various workshops of mind management, my experiences. I was leading the Times Foundation in the year 2003 when the thoughts first came up. So this was a concept which I was talking about those days, was from small I to capital I. You got it? From the individual to infinity. That means the potential of the infinity lies in each individual. But it's very easy. It looks like a very nice, classy statement. But how to go about it? How do we actually, I think Abha, right? Abha mentioned a question. She wants something specific. It's not just some philosophical thoughts which we can exchange over here. So that is what led me to the book. And the book has taken almost 10 years in its making. And it is a very practical kind of a document, therefore. What I realized in real life was, I'm repeating, as using, most of us take our genius to the grave with us because we are either waiting for that momentous thing to happen, कि कुछ होएगा, some miracle will happen, and I will learn how to be bold. That does not happen. The seed already has its own genetic wisdom built into it. I'll try to give it with a very simple example. If I was to give you an apple and ask you what are the number of seeds in that apple, can you respond to that question? You can, no? All you need to do is cut the apple, count it, and tell me whether it is 10 seeds or 12 seeds. Now, if I was to ask you a counter question, that I will show you one apple seed, and I ask you the question, how many apples will grow out of this one seed? Is there any answer to that? No answer. The human seed, from which all of us have come through a stage of the ovum and the sperm getting together to make a zygote, then the fetus, and then the genetic wisdom has already been implanted. For instance, I'm again referring to Azim's example. His genius of sharing, or what we in our terms in the book we would call as existential intelligence, erupted. And it blended very well with your linguistic intelligence and the other kind of mathematical, logical intelligence in your case, which culminated in him being what he is today as a corporate Sufi. So these thoughts which were coming on in my mind, they got blended together with Howard Gardner's thinking on the multiple intelligences. So today we measure our intelligence only as IQ, right? Now IQ has basically failed to bring about or define intelligence in any way. Very difficult to define intelligence. These 9 intelligences are basically what you would call as your natural or your prakritik buddhiyan. They are already there in you when you're born. So you say, where the hell do they vanish? Why does it take me so much time to discover it? And that's where this book aims to help you solve that particular thing. Because unless you go into a self-discovery mode or a self-questioning mode, because nobody knows you better than yourself. We completely focused on that. We say, no, ये मेरे को अच्छी तरह जानता है, वो अच्छे नहीं. आपसे बेहतर आपको और कोई नहीं जान सकता है. Because, so therefore, if you can learn to be a little honest with yourself, all you need is a framework by which if you ask a couple of very specific pointed questions, answer them honestly to yourself, you've got some very, very clear-cut paths laid out in front of you to be able to nurture your own natural intelligences. Nobody else needs to come and help you in that process. So this book talks about all your 9 intelligences, for instance, which I'll just sum up in a quick thing. One is your intrapersonal intelligence, where it's your intelligence within yourself. The interpersonal, the intelligence which you are dealing with the external world, you're socializing. Then you have the linguistic intelligence, your command over words, your command over language. Then you have the musical intelligence, right? See, these are some kinesthetic bodily intelligence. For instance, if I was to take a case of Sachin Tendulkar, right? I do not know, I'm just making a wild claim. I do not know if Sachin Tendulkar was to be administered an IQ test, whether he would pass it or fail it. I don't know. Would he pass it or fail it? Right? So would we, by yardstick, say then, therefore, Sachin is not intelligent? Sachin is intelligent in the domain of what we now call as bodily kinesthetic intelligence. He has the intelligence of movement. He can really, now for instance, if he's standing on the ground and the ball is coming headed towards him, he can actually judge the ball and move his entire body in a format to give it the best shot. Whereas if you and I were to be there, the ball would probably hit us on our face before we even start, getting some sense. So this is bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which exists in various dancers, athletes, sportsmen. Then the existential intelligence, which I talked about, of course, that is the ultimate form of intelligence. If you would please, those of you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, the self-actualization stage, where you really start asking, I don't know whether you asked that question, what is life? What is death? Main yahan kyun hu? These kind of typical questions. Then you have the naturalistic intelligence, where people are very heavily in with nature, like Charles Darwin, people like Charles Darwin or Medha Patkar, very, very involved with this one. So then you have the visual spatial intelligence, which is there in architecture and all. Now, what I am trying to tell you in all this is that IQ cannot judge any of these things. So once you go through these set of questions, you go to the self-discovery stage, you are able to answer certain questions about yourself. There are some very clear-cut paths laid out for you to be able to strengthen all your basic 3 to 4 multiple intelligences. And the second element in that is the learning styles, how you learn. We all learn either by the visual route, or we learn by the auditory route, or we learn by doing. That is the kinesthetic route. If you know how you learn best, and you apply that itself in your academic things, it works wonders. So that is a brief introduction. I think by and large, when we go through the whole thing.
That's very interesting, Ankur. But at what age do you recommend people start this exercise? Because I find that we commit ourselves to a certain line of education or certain line of work pretty early in life. Of course, that's not to say that you can't change it later on, but with the self-awareness journey, shouldn't it start early?
Yes, I quite agree with you completely.
Like you said about Sachin, he discovered pretty early in life what he was good at, but that's not true of everybody.
Right. Okay, that's a great question, and something which is right now occupying my mind completely, because based on this book, we are right now, over the last 3 weeks, I have covered almost about 260 school principals at the pre-primary and primary level, because that is where all these things must start. But before we do that, we have to go down from principals to teachers, and then ultimately these children. The idea is very simple, Anita. The idea being that today in any school, when you divide the students, how are they divided in their particular sections? It's sheer roll numbers, some random, there's no rule of thumb. What would be a simpler, and we are talking about classes with 600, 700 children, so they'll have 7, 8, 9 divisions. I'm talking about India, sir. Now, the whole premise is that if the principals and the teaching profession become aligned with what we call the Prakritik Buddhis and the learning styles, and they're able to identify that in the children can be divided in these 8 or 9 segments according to their Prakritik Buddhis, their natural intelligences. And the whole modality of imparting education to them, therefore, will vary to all these 9. And these experiments have already been done in the K-12 schools in Singapore, Malaysia. And now even Steve Jobs, who's my idol, for instance, he has oriented this entire thing. So children themselves, and I think if you've heard of Sugata Mitra, he's been doing a lot of work on minimum invasive education. His funda is very simple, and that goes extremely well with this, that once you're self-aware, you don't need anybody else to educate you. I'm sorry, I'm making a very controversial statement. You don't need anybody to educate you. Within a group, the group itself can educate yourself, and in a way, the teacher, rather than being a facilitator, is a big intrusion.
Let me tell you my little story. It's not as philosophical or such a discovery as yours. Mine is a more practical journey, and if anything, it's a bold and a real decision. Well, I'm an IIMA graduate like him as well, and had a corporate career. And then suddenly, like a woman in India I found that I had 2 children to bring up, almost alone, because my husband is into cricket, and so he is not really apni marzi ka malik. He has to go where the cricket goes. And so then what does one do in life? You've been dealt out some cards. Not all of them are fair to you. What do? So one of the things we thought was, why don't we marry sport and management? And so he said, okay, it's one of the things we could do. And we checked with a few friends, and they said, great idea. And this was 13 years ago, when motivational speaking or anything like that, really, the genre didn't exist at all. So I remember the 1st of February 2002, we made a 20-minute presentation to Hindustan Unilever about what you can learn from sport. And I remember saying at that time that if we did 25 of these presentations, we'd be really lucky. Now we've done over 350, written a book that's become a bestseller. And all this when I was at best a peripheral follower of sport. So it wasn't really core competence. It was just that, okay, in the given situation, what does one do? So it was bold, it was real, because it was very practical. Being on your own allows you to work from home, which again wasn't a trend very common in those days. And then I brought up my children as well. And I think that has kind of translated into the winning way, because we really don't think about winning as being number one or being the biggest necessarily. It is about being the best that you can. So people think that, Sachin Tendulkar's story is one of talent, that he was born and, when the nurse just handed over the baby, she said, "Oh, Mrs. Tendulkar, here are 100 centuries for you." It didn't happen like that. It is a story as much about attitude, how he practiced, how the kind of sincerity and commitment that he had, and the childlike passion that he has even today. So that is what we call the winning triangle in the winning way. And that is something that we truly believe in, that if you marry the talent that you're born with, and essentially that is something that's God-given. You may have various talents, but that is not something that, some people are just good at maths, and some people aren't. Some people are good at music, others aren't. So finding what you like and finding the genius is, of course, something else, but doing the best that you can and stretching what you already have, the talent that you have. So it's almost like having Dumbledore's sorting hat. When talent comes in, especially in sport, because that's the area we've worked in, people say, we'll probably play 30 tests or probably play 50 tests. And then when you watch people, there are some people who were supposed to play 30 but only end up with 10. And there are some who were supposed to play 30 and end up with 60. And what is the difference? The difference is really in the attitude. What you did with your talent. And there are so many people who just throw talent away. So that brings me to the next topic that is of potential. What is potential? Why do people say that you outperform? Why do people say you underperformed? That is about potential. What do you think?
Well, yes, I think the book basically addresses this entire issue of potential, because potential, who knows the potential? As I told you, when I was giving an example of that apple seed, who knows the potential? Nobody. So we as human beings, we are at least empowered in that particular sense, that we are gifted to be able to analyze ourselves. And it was said, I think, therefore I am. Right? I think right now the time is you say I am, therefore I must think. Now once you get into that thinking process, thinking about yourself is probably the most powerful exercise you can do towards self-awareness. Unless you are self-aware, unless you are awake, nothing is going to happen. I have known of oncologists smoking away, right? Smoking away for years. And you keep telling them, and what will you tell them first of all? You will tell them that smoking is bad for your lungs. Kuch nahi keh sakte. And then something happens. And at the 35th year or 40th year of their life, they just stop. And there may be no epiphanic moment over there which has made them stop, but it just happens. So this is what I'm calling the genetic wisdom, which is just built into you. When it gets triggered, really nobody knows. And only you can come to it. So when you want to identify your potential, unless you go through this step, see some of them, again, we are taking Sachin's example again and again, they are truly blessed in the sense that they became aware of their talent and they had opportunities to be able to, that attitude or to be able to
but
nurture it.
how far can you go, even given a talent? That is how much do you stretch? For example, if you are a pole vaulter or something like that, you fail at a certain level, right? What is it that holds people back from achieving their potential?
So I think building on what Anita and Ankur have spoken, each one of you here, without exception, is nature's greatest miracle. There have been approximately 70 billion people who have walked on this earth. There's never been anybody like you, or 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 anybody here. Today, if you go to the entire world, forget the world, entire universe, you won't find another you, or you, or you, or anyone here. And for eternity to come, there will never be another you. One of my favorite authors, Og Mandino, says, none can duplicate your brushstroke. None can make your chisel mark. None can duplicate your handwriting. None can bear your child. And in truth, none can sell like you. So in my book, Business Balance Beyond, I talk about that each one of us is very powerful. He's unique, he's special. And our power is not outside us. The power is inside us. The power is not without you. The power is within you. The power is not external. The power is internal. And you make 5 commitments to embody, to tap into this power within. And these 5 commitments are embodied in the word power. P-O-W-E-R. P stands for power of giving. The more you give, the more you create. O stands for open your birthday gift. Shine your light and inspire others to shine their light. W stands for have a winning attitude. When you aim low, you reach low. E stands for enlightened persistence. You persist till you succeed. You persist till you succeed. But if you're chasing the wrong goals, you exit. That's why it's called enlightened persistence. And finally, R is for rejuvenation. Nourish your body, nourish your mind, nourish your spirit. A synergistic effect of the body, of the mind, and of the spirit. And rejuvenation also means being present. When you're present, you see signs from the universe. Maybe today there's a sign for you here that can change your life, that can change your direction, and that can change your destiny. When you're present, when you're open. Because the universe is always giving you some sign, but sometimes we are oblivious of the sign. So Anita, to your question, the reason we curb our potential is firstly, we don't aim too high. If I may give an example of sports, I was coaching my son in soccer. I said, pass the ball in football. So he was passing the ball to my chest. So I said, Tawfiq, you're right midfield. When you're passing the ball, can you pass the ball a bit higher near my head so I can score with the header? So he passes the ball on my chest. I said, Tawfiq, don't chest, on the head. And he hits the ball on my chest. I said, Tawfiq, can you keep your eyes up and chip the ball near my head? So, and he hits the ball on my chest. So the more I make him try to hit the ball on my head, the more he hits the ball on my chest. To the point I gave up. I said, Tawfiq, it's not working. So I gave up, and next day I go to his football practice. And his coach is making him do the same drill of passing the ball with one exception. The coach is making them hit the ball on a baseball fence, which is 10 times higher than the head. And he's asking them to hit the ball right at the top of the fence. So I'm sitting in the car and smiling at Tawfiq. I said, Tawfiq, you didn't listen to your dad. Now look, how are you going to hit the ball there when you can't hit the ball here? So I'm smiling at him, and Tawfiq goes back, and he hits the ball. Now, if this is the fence 10 times higher, he hits it almost to the top. Not once, not twice, 3 times. I was blown away. I couldn't make him hit the ball here. Now I think the ball 10 times higher. Am I a bad coach or what? What do you think happened? He was aiming low, reaching low. Aiming high, reaching high. So if you are nature's greatest miracle, nobody walks like you, nobody talks like you, nobody thinks like you, nobody can duplicate your thumb mark. But if you aim low, what happens? When you don't believe in yourself, nobody else believes in you. When you think small, you remain small. What the mind conceives, the mind achieves. If you go to the ocean with 1 bucket, what do you get? You only get 1 bucket of water. So being bold is to believe in yourself. And being authentic, when you're authentic, you're the most powerful. Because then you are the unique self. Because you're you. You're not trying to copy somebody else. That's when you become the most powerful. Because you believe in you. Not in an egotistical sense, but in a positive pride sense. And that's being authentic. And the reason we're not authentic, because since childhood we are conditioned by our parents, by our teachers, by our peers. We get fearful because we feel maybe I'm not good enough. Or we have scarcity mentality that if I give something, somebody will take advantage of me. If you let go of all these inhibitions of conditioning, of fear, of scarcity, you fly like a bird. You bloom like a flower. You shine like a star. So natural and so effortless. Have you ever seen a bird struggle to fly? Have you ever seen a flower struggle to bloom? Have you ever seen a star struggle to shine? Why are we struggling? Because we have ceased to be authentic. So when you become authentic, when you realize that I am nature's greatest miracle, suddenly you shine your light. And that's where the genius comes about.
Yeah, but I find that if people are comfortable doing reasonably well, they don't want to push themselves any more because they're afraid of failing. They don't want to look stupid. I'm okay, you know, as I am. And nobody knows that I'm afraid of doing something else that actually might make me better or more successful or whatever, go to the next level. But it's this fear of failure. And particularly, I think in the Indian subcontinent, failure is treated very badly. Of course, I see things changing now, especially with so many entrepreneurs around, because there are so many failed startups and people are actually looking for people who have failed startups because they say that the startup might have failed, but you have learned a lot. And they're actually looking for people like that. So people who might have tried and failed rather than not tried at all. So did you find that in the West as well? Fear of failure,
yeah, I
or
mean,
how is failure treated?
Yeah, everybody in the world has this fear of failure. But I think the reason that fear comes, it comes from ego. If I fail, I will look bad.
Yes.
But when you have a goal larger than self, there's no fear. It's not about you. It's about a goal larger than you. Then the subject, which is you, disappears in the object, which is the goal. That's when power happens. If it's about you, then the ego comes in, then the fear comes in. Oh, I'll fail, and people will look down upon me. But if you have a goal larger than you disappear, there is no fear. So yes, fear is a real thing. I think somebody has a question. Maybe we should invite them. Yeah.
Somebody wants to change. I mean, in the mundane world, they look at economics. See, if I want to change something, I may have to go that way. But changing the economic is somewhere. I have a set goal that way. So that may be one of the reasons people who want to do something may not try to do it.
I can answer that with a single thing. See, any change will always come about with a choice. Now that choice, how you can make that particular choice, because obviously if you're expecting a complete comfort level in being bold, you know the risks associated with being bold, and that is where the fear is keeping you away from it, because it doesn't allow you. You're in your comfort zone, and all of us are very scared of exiting our comfort zone and entering into a completely new zone of discomfort. It is there where I want to mention a little bit more on this failure aspect and fear aspect. Why do we have this fear of failure? You see, the fear of failure comes about only when we enter into the domain of comparing ourselves. When we compare ourselves, then we say, oh, I'm not good enough, he's better. Now, if you were to drop that, if you were to just drop that can I be better than what I am right now? When you are in that domain, then your choices will become easier for you. And as you mentioned, probably most of the fears are economic based. Now, I can only give you my example. For instance, when I left the corporate sector, I had no economic this thing to fall back upon. But there was that sheer confidence in myself that I will not sleep hungry a single night. And I did not need to take the help of anybody at all. Because, you see, that is the conviction which comes in from within you. Once you've taken that.
A lot of times people are scared of short-term, giving up something. But if you're convinced that in the long run that's going to be a better decision, then yes, to achieve something, I think you'll have to give up something.
That's what I said, a matter of choice.
You know, Khalil Gibran says it beautifully. He says, passion alone can lead to its own destruction. Reason alone is very boring and dull. But when you marry passion and reason, it's a dynamic balance. In other words, I think when I gave up my accounting career, I didn't just give it up. Gradually, I gave it up. I got my wife involved in the accounting business. My business partner got involved. To now, my accounting business is still running. And they're making more money without me. So I empowered them. That gave me the base to do my new career. In my new career, I jumped off the cliff backwards because I went all out. But I had something that was going on. So you can use your reason and your passion and marry those two, which gives you the best kind of balance. Because you don't want to, when I changed my career, my son was 3 years old. My daughter was 8. So of course my wife was very nervous and she said, look, you're not going to do it. And the only reason she allowed me to change my career was on a condition that we don't sell our accounting businesses. So you need to kind of marry those two, and yeah,
Figure
of
out
course.
what's your own safety net.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and as Ankur says, I mean, you got to have some belief. You only have one life, my friends, only one life. When you die, most people regret not what they did, they regret what they didn't do. You have one life, it's your life. Don't chase other people's goals. If you chase other people's goals, you'll never be happy.
How many people here really believe that they should have done something else, studied or worked than what they're doing?
Just one person?
Just, yeah. Yeah, Ankur, you do a lot of work with schools, and I find that, decision making is something of a habit. It's not something that, I suddenly grow up and become an adult or become a leader or whatever and then start taking decisions. So unless you're encouraged to take decisions, you are not going to be able to do it later on. So start small. But we find that, in our society, we are constantly, first we ask our parents and our teachers and then our bosses, and we are always looking for, instructions, really. What happens in schools? Aren't you expected to conform? Or is it changing now?
Yeah, Anita, I'll answer that question. Just let's address ourselves. Yeah?
Ma'am, decisions are like muscles. You need to take them to be able to take bigger ones. Absolutely. And I guess as a very conventional middle class student who was always a topper, I think I just woke up to this decision one day that I consistently have to be a topper. And this is it. My work's cut out for me. And my focus was academic, but then I guess my passion was also in writing, in the creative field. But then I come from a conventional accounts family, commerce family, business family. They're either accountants, chartered accountants, or they're businessmen. And it felt ludicrous to even suggest that I'd want to do anything creative. So that was that. And then at the age of 19, I had a midlife crisis when I was doing my chartered accountancy. And it hit me like a tsunami that I don't want to do this. But then I didn't know how to back out of it because I had never taken a decision in my entire life. And this is 10 years ago. Back then, this was a very different country. This was a different economy. Things have changed in 10 years, which haven't changed maybe 100 years. That kind of...
You were born too early.
I was born too early.
I feel that several times. You were born too early.
I was born too early. So, like I said, midlife crisis at 19. And then I traumatized my parents by being passive-aggressive. I flunked my chartered accountancy because I didn't know how else to get out of it. So I made myself flunk it that, acha, isse chutkara milega. So I made sure that I flunked chartered accountancy so that I don't have to get into accounts. And then after my TY, I said, I am not studying one day for more. So they said, okay, get into MBA, get into something else. I didn't want to get into anything. I have to figure out who I am. Because it just occurred to me that I am a topper. I am, the girl people point to and say, aisi beti, uski jaisa dekh, you should get such marks, you should have so many trophies. But I didn't know who I was. I was an achiever in all the right ways, what a middle class child is supposed to be, but I didn't know who I was. So how do I decide? So for 2 years, 3 years, my parents had to bear the shame of the daughter not being involved in any educational activity. And then at the age of 24, I went and got myself an MBA. I said, while I figure out what I want to do, it's better to have a safety net. So I got an MBA, but then I realized that, okay, I think I can be, if nothing else, if I don't know what else I want to do, I can be a good manager. So that
Anyway, it was your choice, and that I think makes a lot of difference. When you choose and you are passionate about something, then your performance really goes.
First of all, I've interacted with people of your kind. Thanks for sharing your experience, first of all. It is these kind of experiences which have actually made me write the book. Because I've seen so many young people in that stage of, kya karna hai, kya nahi karna hai, what is expected, blah, blah, blah. And this, I believe, answering your question, that it comes from our educational system itself. And where does it come from? If we were to go before 1850s, the system of education we had was Gurukul, right? In 1850s, the famous Lord Macaulay minutes, which have been recorded, where they said they needed only education for two purposes. One is for the Indian Army, and the other for the East India Company. So the rule was very simple. Ye karna hai, aise karna hai, karte raho. So you'll have these babus even now continuing with the same thing. Military also the same thing. Shoot him. But sir, he's my brother. No problem. Shoot him. Shoot. So that same mentality, despite our 65 years of independence, still continues. And that is what we are trying to now impact at the school level. The same thing which you're saying, teachers, now for instance, I could give you a very specific example. Class 5 Marathi book, there's a word, jhatap. I'm not a Marathi, jhatap. It has been continuing for the last 30 years with a very crudely drawn visual. I've asked people what does jhatap mean, so the typical meaning means a quarrel between two people, jhatap. But jhatap is actually a ventilator cover or a window cover. Now, even if you were to match with the visual in the textbook, there is no way even an adult will say that this is jhatap. Now, I asked this question to these principals after they identified it. I said, why have you not done anything about it then? Last 25, 30 years. Can't you think of another word with jha like jhanda, which is familiar to the child? Why jhatap only and that crudely drawn thing continuing? So these are the kind of rethinking things we have to do. Therefore, we are going through the route of the, so fortunately, this book is being supported by the Maharashtra government, and I'm getting access to the principals, the teachers, and it is, I think it will take, it's a matter of years. Because this mentality cannot be changed overnight. It's
Yeah,
not
I think
possible.
when we stop accepting that this is the way things are and this is the way things have always been, that's when you can kind of change things.
So, Mr. Jamal, when I heard you empower us, I felt inspired. But the problem with me is it is very momentary. So when I go out of it and next day, tomorrow, I wake up and I take the beatings. Like when I write my best story, when I've researched and I've given my best, it is not received with the appreciation I would want. So people do not see, which I see as my talent, people don't see it as a talent. And for a moment, I feel depressed. I know ideally I should be working on it, but I feel depressed for a moment and I feel the need to moan for a minute, for some time. So how do I come back?
So two things. Number one is if today you've got a small spark somewhere, either hearing Ankur, Anita or myself, small spark. Now that's a spark you want to run with and act upon before it fizzles out, right? You see, lives change with that spark. I changed my career when I was crying like a baby. I was shaken, and my life has never been the same. In fact, I felt that I could die for a cause like that. I was 43, I'd never found a cause I would die for. And ironically, when I found a cause I would die for, my life began. Before that, I was dead. So if you get a spark, you want to make the most of the spark and go home, listen to nothing else, and act upon it. That's number one. Number two, remember, like Rumi says, it's a long journey. You got to be boiled before you become something. Otherwise, you're raw, you're not cooked. Prophets went through struggle, obstacles. They're so close to God. Why? So struggle, obstacles are very important part and parcel of success. You show me a person who hasn't struggled, and I'll show you a person who hasn't succeeded. You show me a person who hasn't failed, and I'll show you a person who hasn't succeeded. You show me a person who hasn't gone through enormous challenges, I'll show you a person who hasn't succeeded. The more they've struggled, the more challenges they've gone through, the more hurdles, the bigger their success. So don't turn your back to struggle. Don't turn your back to obstacles. Say, I'm here, come along. The more the merrier. And then you watch. Okay? You watch. Every step you take, every step. And by the way, the joy is in the journey. I wrote a book called 7 Steps to Lasting Happiness as part of the Corporate Sufi series, which you'll see them outside. And I spent 10,000 hours writing that book. Okay? But one of the main messages of the book is that happiness is not a destination. Happiness is a journey. So enjoy the ride, enjoy the struggle, enjoy the obstacle, enjoy the put downs. Every time you put down, you bounce back bigger and stronger. Every time you put down, you bounce back bigger and stronger. That's how you become a genius. That's how you get the seeds of greatness. That's how you marry the sports metaphors with your life. And yeah, it's your life and you go for it and enjoy the ups as well as enjoy the downs. Because when the night is the darkest, dawn is the closest.
I also realized, Abha, just a personal that a lot of times we think that other people are responsible for our happiness, and our motivation. And so we feel, oh, somebody's not appreciated us, no pat on the back, I've done a wonderful job. If you have an internal sense of purpose, a goal, then I think that should be enough to motivate you. That if you believe that you've done a great job, you've written a great story, that should be enough.
I want to add it just comes to my mind, there's a very famous this thing by Hemant Kumar, I think, probably. It says, हमें उन राहों पे चलना है, जहाँ गिरना और संभलना है. When you walk, you are definitely going to fall. You can't be just walking straight up all the way. If you were to drive from here to Pune, You can't, on the expressway, you can go at 120, 130 kilometers per hour. Can you do that within Bombay? No, you cannot. So you'll have to have those stops, and they are part and parcel of, you learn with the pain, basically.
So, I've been mentioning this question in most of the sessions. 2 years ago, I'd almost failed the 10th standard, sir. And then today I've written 2 non-fiction books. I'm 19 years old. And based on the multiple intelligence thing, I've been studying the lives of students. And when I was in school, nobody appreciated the fact that I could write as well. And I was constantly told, as a society, we're looking at only one kind of intelligence, which you also must have noticed, which is the logical kind of intelligence. What about the students that want to do something in music? So that's the question to you, sir. How do we become more appreciative of students who want to do different things? And just one small question to Miss Anitha. Anitha ma'am, you had mentioned Sachin putting in the 10,000 hours. And several more, exactly. There was a school in England called A.S. Neil. He started the school called the Summerhill School, which is based on letting students educate themselves in things they want to educate themselves in. For instance, in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Beatles played 1,200 shows. Bill Gates had he did 4 hours of computing. Andre Agassi hit 10,000 tennis shots every morning. Tiger Woods was made to hit 5,000 push shots. So
That's the only way.
Exactly.
Effort, yeah,
So
and
how can we design an education system that allows young people to put in their 10,000 hours, rather than doing something at school, doing another course at the bachelor's level, doing a master's level course that's completely unrelated, then doing a PhD program that's not related to this, and doing a job that's completely something else.
Absolutely.
So how do we avoid that?
I fully empathize with your situation, and that is precisely where one is trying to do some work in that particular domain. It's very, very important. We do not know how many geniuses actually land up in the grave because of that. You were bold enough, now I think with you were bold enough to understand that you had certain amount of linguistic thing, which made you do what you did. How many people have that empowerment coming in as a support from the education system or from society? Very few. Right? So this is exactly the domain in which one is trying to work, but the results will take some time. And I can only invite you to be a part of this mission.
It's a mindset change that is required in society. First of all, this herd mentality that everybody does medicine, everybody does engineering, which fortunately is changing. And I think we need more Sanjeev Kapoors and Sandeep Soparkars of the world who will say, no, there are other careers also to be made. And so you're luckier because you are younger than us. Our times were a little different. The other mindset changes, I find that people say, oh, you're weak in math, so you need tuition. It should be the other way around. You're great at ballet, so I think you need to spend more time doing that. But it'll happen, I think, gradually. It's not that easy.
The intention and the whole exercise is well directed in order to motivate us to find the genius within us, which is very encouraging. But we all have our own filters when we say we are geniuses, and we don't want to bury ourselves, and I don't think anybody buried himself. Somebody else has to bury us on the lighter vein. What I'm getting at is that a lot of geniuses are alive and they are actually dead, basically because it's not because they are not aware that they are good. It is basically because those who are around them don't recognize them, number one. Number two, because they don't know that they are genius, or they don't care whether they are genius, because they are all thinking about themselves. We don't have the etiquette of appreciating the good in the other person. We always are very clear and articulative in terms of finding out what is wrong with the person in a genuine way. And so therefore, there is a lot of negativity in all our non-fiction, whatever exercises we have. We are becoming popular in criticizing rather than affirming. And so therefore, we are people who are walking as dead people. If everybody is genius, a lot of genius, all of us are actually dead. And so therefore, I believe what is contributing to this deadness is meaningless competition, and in that competitive world, trying to be alive and make sense to people who want to articulate in a way that is acceptable to the society. And it is clearly connected to economics in the sense how much money you can make, and popularity, whether you're number one in the society. All these put together has only made people multiply themselves in not able to know what is our true potential. We cannot be geniuses according to somebody else's potential. We can be geniuses only according to our own potential. But we don't know, and the question is where do we start? And we need a crisis to start off, like Brother Azim. Okay, so we need help. And it is true that we can motivate ourselves, but we can also get demotivated and get depressed and end up in a mental asylum. It is mostly geniuses who are getting disappointed and ending up in suicides. Is there any help that one of the ways that we can do is only when I affirm what is good in you, then only I can actualize myself in my potential. If I cannot see good in you, I cannot be good for myself. That's the way I look at it. I would like to comment. I'd like your comments, please.
Professor, I think that's a very profound inference which you have drawn, and it projects reality. I think for that, the kind of efforts which are needed are huge and massive, because you are trying to, as Anita just said, you have to change the mindset of the people completely, right? Now, within that domain, the genius of the self-identification of genius, that is where it ties up very well with being bold. One has to be bold enough. Now, when you give your example of most of the geniuses lying in suicide cases, of, what comes to our mind is Dr. John Nash, for instance, a very clear example, who landed up in the insanity asylums, right? These things will continue happening, but so long as you are keeping the external focus, or you are keeping an external yardstick to measure yourself, this will continue happening. And that is where, once you bring in self-awareness, you can develop enough strength of your purpose that let's remember when Einstein came with this theory of relativity, there were only 3 people who understood that. Did it mean that Einstein was wrong? But he had the conviction to be able to go beyond that, and ultimately all of us have accepted it. So it's not always the majority which is right. So I stay with your statement. It's a sad fact of reality, but it's a...
Absolutely. I think we cannot ignore society, but we don't need validation for our worth from everybody all the time. And which is why I said right in the beginning that, the way we have defined being a winner is that if you can be the best that you can. Just imagine in sport, you always say control the controllables. If you are a swimmer in the first lane, you have absolutely no control over what somebody else is going to do. And so something that's, if somebody else is better than you, then you just, hard luck, you just try harder next time. You can't really, you got to do the best you can and hope that that will be the best of the lot.
But the point is that I don't have to be better than the other.
Correct. So that's...
Because we are at a different potentials. So
That was the other point I'm saying. Why does it always have to be relative? It can be
I'll
absolute.
give a very, it just comes to my mind. My son was 4 years old and he taught me this lesson extremely well. We were on a vacation and a friend's daughter was also, and both of them were given glasses of milk, right? So Abhinav, that's my son, he said, I will come first. You normally raise them out. And this girl, she said, no, I am going to come first. So Abhinav responds in he says, Shipra, we can both come first, and otherwise I'm okay with coming second. And the same guy right now won the Dean citation in Columbia University just about 3 months back.
I think you should have been sitting here because you really profoundly summarized the whole session. But I think, yes, your point is valid that we can inspire other people. Rumi was inspired by Shams Tabriz. Okay, Shams Tabriz may not have done anything much more, but he inspired Rumi, who wrote 26,000 couplets and became a genius. 12th century Rumi is now top poet in North America even today. So yes, we can inspire others. However, all of us here are 100% responsible for our life. 100% responsible means 100% responsible. If you're not responsible, somebody else is responsible for your life, you'll always wait. and you'll wait for somebody else to inspire you, and maybe it'll never happen. But we are responsible for our life. We can respond to our life. And that's about being bold and being aware and taking a chance, right? So that's very important. Thirdly, really, when you die, you don't take what you have. You only take what you give. You're born with a 0. Then you get 10, 100, 1,000, million, 10 million, 20 million. Die with a 0. So you're born with a 0, gather more zeros, and die with 0. So nothing matters in the end. 100 years from now, it won't matter what car you drove. It won't matter how big your house was. It won't matter how much money you have in the bank account. But the world will be a different place if you're important in the life of a child. So every day, lay some seeds of greatness by doing good things. If other people don't do good to you, it doesn't matter. Don't rely on other people. Rely on you. You are nature's greatest miracle. And if you do that, then suddenly your energy goes into the circle of influence, which is even small, and not circle of concern, which is big. And the more you focus on the small circle of influence, the more that circle enlarges and impacts the circle of concern. So that is the meaning of being bold. That is the meaning of being aware. That is the meaning of taking charge of your life. If it's to be, my friend and colleague Brian Tracy would say, if it's to be, it's up to me. If it's to be, it's up to me. If it's to be, guess what? It's up to me. Not in the egotistical sense, but in the sense of I'm in charge of my life. I am the architect of my life. I am the captain of my ship, and I am the master. I am the master of my destiny. I think that's the way.